The road bent twice before the house showed itself, and both times Reva counted the distance to tree cover. 40 yards on the first bend, 60 on the second. With a dry creek bed between, that would slow anyone running in boots. She noted these the way she noted the wind direction and the position of the sun, which sat 2 hands above the ridge and would blind anyone on the porch looking east. The house was wrong for a man alone. Too clean, too square at the corners, with a porch rail that had been sanded smooth by someone who cared whether hands got splinters. Green skin weathered by road dust, she walked the last quarter mile with the canvas roll across her back, feeling the knives shift against the bone setters wrapped beneath them. The ranch spread out below the road like a hand laid flat. 60 head, maybe more, grazing the gold grass in the loose clusters. 1 barn, 1 outbuilding with a forged dark chimney. A dog on the porch, brown and heavy-eared, watching her with its chin on its paws. The man stood at the rail. He was not large. That was the first thing she catalogued. Average height, work lean, with the kind of stillness that came from either patience or exhaustion. His hands gripped the rail, but not tightly. No weapon visible. She looked at the door behind him, then at the windows, then at the distance between the porch and the road she'd come up. 7 seconds. She could cover it in 7 seconds if she dropped the roll. He looked at her knives, looked at his kitchen through the open door, looked back at her. Suppers at 6, he said. The stove pulls left. She waited for the rest. The questions. The narrowing of eyes. The second look at her skin. The careful recalculation that always followed when they realized the territorial labor exchange did not specify species on its contracts. He stepped aside and held the door. The kitchen was the center of the house. She knew this the way she knew which rooms people lived in and which they only passed through. The stove was good iron, a Hartwell 6-plate with brass fittings gone green, and someone had loved it once. The grease was layered wrong now, built up in the corners where a careful hand would never let it settle. The flue plate had a crack running from the left bolt to the center seam. She touched it with 2 fingers and felt the drawer pulling uneven, just as he'd said. Left. 1 chair sat at the table. A second was pushed against the far wall with its back turned out, as if someone had decided it should face the room but changed their mind halfway. She set her canvas roll on the floor by the door and opened the pantry. Flour, salt, lard gone slightly rancid, dried beans, coffee, the bones of a kitchen that had once been stocked by someone who knew what to do with it. Firewood, she said. Box on the south wall. There's an axe in the outbuilding if you need to split more. Water. Pumps out back. Pulls clean. She asked nothing else. He offered nothing else. He stood in the kitchen doorway for 4 seconds, and she counted them, and then he walked toward the barn with the dog at his heel. Reva built the fire first. The stove needed 20 minutes to heat right, and the pull was worse than a crack should account for. Soot in the upper flue, probably. She could fix that, but not tonight. Tonight she made what the pantry allowed. Bean soup with the last of the dried rosemary she'd found in a jar behind the coffee. Cornbread from flour that was only a week past its best. She cleaned the stovetop while things cooked, scraping grease with the back of a knife, working in the kind of silence she preferred. The kitchen smelled like lard and iron, and underneath that, dust and dry grass through the window she'd cracked open 2 inches. He came in when the light turned amber, washed his hands at the basin without being told the food was ready. She set his plate. He sat in the 1 chair. She stood near the stove because there was nowhere else to sit that did not involve the turned-out chair, and she would not touch another person's furniture without knowing what it meant. He ate everything. Slowly, the way men ate who had forgotten what hunger felt like and were remembering it 1 bite at a time. The soup was plain. The cornbread was dry at the edges. Neither of them spoke. She heard the dog settle outside the kitchen door, the creak of the house in wind, and somewhere down the hall a door that didn't latch, clicking against its frame. He set his spoon down. That's the first hot meal I haven't burned in 2 years. She took his plate to the basin and washed it, The water was cold. She washed the pot next, and the spoon, and the cornbread pan, and by the time she turned around, he had gone. The kitchen held the smell of food, and the lamp he'd left burning for her turned low. She walked the house in the dark, not snooping, mapping. The hall had 3 doors. One open, his, with a boot visible on the floor inside. One closed, with the dog lying across the threshold, its ears twitching in sleep but its body pressed to the wood, as though holding something in. The third was small, at the end, and when she opened it, she found a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, and her canvas roll set against the wall by the headboard. He had carried it from the kitchen. She had not asked him to. He had set it where she could reach it in the dark, angled so her hand would find the knives first, and she stood in the doorway turning that over like a stone in her palm. A man who noticed where a woman would want her tools at night was either careful or dangerous, and she had not decided which. On the windowsill, she could see the yard, the fence post near the road, where 2 loaves of bread sat cooling in the last of the light. She watched him walk out, pick up 1 loaf, and carry it to the post. He set it there the way you set something down for someone who was coming. Then he went back inside and did not look at it again. She did not understand it yet. Above the barn door, barely visible in the going dark, words had been carved into the lintel, old letters, deepened by weather. She read them through the glass, mouthing each one without sound. The land remembers who worked it. Reva closed the door, set the canvas roll where her hand would find it. Knives on top, the wrap beneath. She lay down facing the door and did not sleep for a long time, listening to the house settle around a man who baked bread for someone who was not coming back. 3 days, and the woman had not stolen anything, burned anything, or left in the night. Caleb counted this as he counted most things since Honora died, by what had not gone wrong. The kitchen smelled different now. Not better exactly, but occupied. The grease he'd let build in the stove corners was half gone, scraped clean in layers like she was negotiating with the iron instead of fighting it. She cooked twice a day and ate standing near the window, plate in hand, eyes on the yard. He had not once seen her sit in a chair. He rode to town on the 3rd morning before she was up. The general store was quiet that early, just Harmon behind the counter sorting nails into bins. Caleb set his list down and watched Harmon read it with the slow attention of a man who charged by the item and wanted to make sure he hadn't missed one. Dried sage, Harmon read. Juniper bark. Smoked salt. You cooking fancy now. Hired a cook. I heard. Harmon pulled a jar from the shelf and held it to the light. Whole town heard. Marta Dawes said she saw a green woman walking your road Tuesday carrying what looked like a sword on her back. Kitchen knives. Fair enough. Caleb did not use the phrase himself, but he would remember it later. The way Harmon said it, as if Caleb's business was a country he had decided not to visit. These are frontier standard herbs. You want me to throw in some of the orc cut spices? Got a few from the last trade wagon. She's cooking human recipes. Then these'll do. Harmon wrapped them in brown paper and pushed the bundle across the counter. The smoked salt's right for a heavy hand on stews. That what she's making. Bean soup mostly. Caleb paid and picked up the bundle. She uses rosemary like it owes her money. Then she'll want the sage. Harmon leaned on the counter. You doing all right out there? Doing fine. Polk coming back this season. Already sent word. He'll be out next week. Caleb walked out before Harmon could ask anything else. The social cost of the trip sat between his shoulders like a sunburn. He did not enjoy being talked about. He had not enjoyed it when Honora was alive, and he enjoyed it less now that every conversation in town circled back to the same question asked in 6 different ways. He loaded the herbs into his saddlebag and rode the 40 minutes home with the wind at his back and the sun climbing white over the grass. He put the herbs in the pantry while she was hanging wash on the line behind the house. Flour, salt, the smoked salt in its clay jar, dried sage, juniper bark for smoking meat if she wanted to try it. He did not arrange them. He set them on the shelf where the gaps were and closed the pantry door. She found them that afternoon. He knew because the evening soup tasted different. The sage came through under the beans, not on top of them, and the smoked salt had done something to the broth that made it sit heavier on the tongue. She did not mention the herbs. He did not mention the ride. They ate in the silence that had become the shape of their evenings, him in the chair, her standing by the window, the dog outside the kitchen door. After supper, she went to the outbuilding. He watched from the barn, mending tack that didn't need mending, while she mixed something in a bucket. She worked with her back to him, and he could see the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like a woman who knew she was being watched and had decided it did not matter. She carried the bucket inside. He heard the sound of metal on metal, a scraping, then a long silence. He went to the kitchen an hour later and stood in the doorway. The flue plate was patched. She'd mixed forged clay from the tight outbuilding stores, tight powder and redite earth, and packed it into the crack with her fingers. The surface was rough but sealed. He could see the marks where she'd smoothed it with the heel of her hand. The stove was burning, and the smoke pulled straight up the flue for the first time in 2 years. No listing left. No catch in the drawer. Clean. He stood where Honora used to stand when the stove was new, in the doorway with one hand on the frame, watching the heat shimmer above the plates. The memory came fast and without permission, Honora testing the drawer by holding a strip of cloth over the vent, laughing when it snapped upward. He stepped away from the doorframe before the thought finished itself. Poke arrived the following Tuesday. He was a quiet man, somewhere past 50, who had worked the ranch for 3 seasons and did not ask questions about matters that were not fences or cattle. He ate lunch at the kitchen table and studied Reva with the frank, unhurried attention of a man who had seen enough of the world to measure people by what they did instead of what they were. "Stove's drawing better," Poke said. "She fixed the flue plate," Caleb said. Poke looked at Reva, who was cutting carrots at the counter with a knife that moved faster than it should have. "With what?" "Forged clay." "Huh." Poke ate his soup. "Good soup." Reva said nothing. She finished the carrots and added them to tomorrow's stock pot. Poke ate a second bowl, pushed back from the table, and went out to check the south fence line. The whole interaction had taken 8 minutes. That evening, Kettle did something she had not done since Honora died. The dog left her post at the closed bedroom door, walked through the kitchen, pushed through the screen with her nose, and lay down on the porch at Reva's feet. Reva was sitting on the top step cleaning her knives with an oiled rag, and she looked down at the dog for a long moment, then went back to her work without touching her. Caleb watched this from the barn. Kettle had not chosen anyone since Honora. The dog guarded the room and the doorway, and the memory of a voice that used to call her inside at dusk. And she did not move from that post. Until now. He could have said something. He could have walked over and remarked on it. Made it a thing that had a shape and a name. He picked up a bridle that was already clean and worked the leather between his fingers until the impulse passed. She was outside scrubbing forged clay from under her nails, working the red earth out from the cuticles with a splinter of kindling. Her face turned down and her attention complete. Like patching a man's stove was the same as washing a pot or splitting wood. Like it cost her nothing. The kitchen behind her smelled of clean iron and sage, and the smoke from the chimney rose in a single straight line against the sky going dark. He stood where Honora used to stand, and did not finish the thought. She heard the calf before she saw it, a sound like tearing, high and thin, coming from the east fence where the grass grew over the bottom rail. Reva set down the pot she was scrubbing and dried her hands on her apron without hurrying. She had learned years ago that running toward a sound like that did not change what you found when you got there. Caleb was already at the fence line. The calf was tangled in wire where a post had rotted and split, its left foreleg bent at an angle that meant one of two things. Either the bone had snapped clean, or it had shattered, and the difference between those two facts was the difference between a splint and a rifle. Caleb had the rifle. He held it low against his thigh, not aimed, not yet, but his thumb was on the stock, and his jaw was set the way she had seen men set their jaws before they did a thing they did not want to do, but had already decided on. The calf screamed again, It was a young animal, maybe 4 months, brown and white with mud caked along its belly. Its eyes rolled white and its good legs churned the dirt. Reva knelt beside it. She did not ask permission. She put one arm across the calf's neck and chest and pressed down with the weight that came from her shoulders, not her hands, pinning the animal flat against the ground. It bucked once. She held. The calf's breathing changed, from panic to the shallow, rapid panting of an animal that has been overpowered, and knows it. Caleb stepped back half a pace. She felt it more than saw it, the shift in the grass behind her, the small retreat of a man recalculating. She ran her fingers down the foreleg. The brake was midshaft, clean, the kind that separated under traction if you pulled true, not shattered. She could feel the edges of the bone through the swelling, two halves that wanted to meet if someone told them how. She stripped the linen from her apron with her teeth and tore it into strips without letting go of the calf. "Fence slat," she said. "That one." She pointed with her chin at the broken post. "The flat piece, about as long as my forearm." Caleb set the rifle against the fence and pulled the slat free. He handed it to her without speaking. She took it, measured it against the calf's leg, and snapped 2 inches off the end with one hand. The wood broke sharp and clean. She set the bone. Her hands were large and very still. She aligned the break by feel, both thumbs pressing the fragments into place while the calf shuddered under her arm, and then she bound the splint tight with the linen strips, wrapping from below the knee to above the break in overlapping turns that would hold through swelling. The calf made a sound, smaller now, something between a bleat and a sigh, and its legs stopped churning. Caleb watched her tie off the last strip. The rifle leaned against the fence behind him like a question that had been answered by someone else. "You've done that before." She stood, dirt on her knees, linen fibers stuck to her forearms, her hands steady at her sides. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment that lasted one breath longer than necessary. Then he picked up the calf, careful of the splinted leg, and carried it toward the barn. He did not ask where she learned it. She watched him walk away. His shoulders carried the calf the way they carried everything, evenly, without complaint, like the weight was just another thing the day had asked of him. The rifle stayed against the fence. She picked it up and carried it inside and hung it on the wall where it belonged. Her knives were on the kitchen counter where she had left them. In her pack, beneath the canvas roll, the bone setter's wrap sat folded in its oiled cloth. She had not taken it out. She had set that bone with her bare hands and an apron and a fence slat, because taking out the wrap would have meant explaining the wrap, and explaining the wrap would have meant explaining the woman who taught her to use it, and that woman was dead, and the people who said Reva killed her were not. She made supper. Caleb came in from the barn smelling of straw and iodine. He had cleaned the calf's leg and laid fresh bedding without being told. He sat in his chair and ate the stew she had made, and did not mention the bone or the rifle, or the way she had held a 200-pound animal still with one arm. "Calf's resting," he said. "Reckon so. Splint's holding." She nodded. He finished his stew. She finished hers standing by the window, the way she always did, watching the light thin out over the grass. Poke had gone home for the night. Kettle lay on the porch with her nose pointed toward the barn, as if she knew something was in there that needed watching. After supper, Reva went to check the splint. The calf was sleeping on its side, the bad leg stretched out straight, and the binding had not shifted. She adjusted the top wrap where the linen had started to curl at the edge, and sat back on her heels in the straw. The barn smelled of hay and old wood, and the particular warmth of an animal breathing slow. She stayed past dark. Checked the splint twice more, running her fingers along the edge of the bone to feel for swelling that would mean she'd bound it too tight. The second time, she found a tin cup on the barn rail, still warm. Coffee, black, with the grit of grounds at the bottom the way he made it. She had not heard him come out. She drank it in the lamplight, and did not go inside until the calf's breathing was deep and even. It was Sunday again, when the pattern repeated. She was in the kitchen before dawn and heard him in the other room. The soft thud of the flour bag on the counter. The scrape of the measuring cup against the tin. He baked bread for 2 every Sunday. Leaves 1 loaf on the fence post. She watched through the window as he carried it out in the early light. Set it on the flat top of the post, the way a man sets a plate for someone who is late to dinner, and walked back without looking at it. She counted the gesture this time. The way his hand lingered on the post for half a second. The way his fingers opened slowly as if releasing something he had been holding all week. The recipe belonged to a body that was no longer in the room. The calf slept in the barn on clean straw, its leg splintered with fence slat and linen. The rifle was on the wall. Her knives were in the kitchen. The wrap stayed in her pack. She was counting on him never asking. Sunday came the way it always did, with flour on the counter before dawn. Reva did not watch him bake. She had learned the sound of it by now, the scrape of the cup against the tin, the particular rhythm of his hands working dough on the board, and she stayed in the kitchen doorway with her back against the frame and her eyes on the yard. The calf was walking on its splint in the barn pen. She could see it through the open door, testing the leg with the careful patience of a young animal that does not understand what happened, but has accepted the terms. Caleb carried the loaf out to the fence post. She did not turn to watch, but she heard the screen door, the creak of the porch step, the soft scrape of crust on wood as he set it down. When he came back inside, he smelled like morning air and flour, and the faint sweetness of bread, still warm enough to steam. He poured water from the kettle and did not speak. She scraped the last of the oats from the pot and set his bowl on the table. They ate. The silence was not uncomfortable. It had become a kind of language between them, a space where neither was required to perform anything, and she had started to notice that she breathed slower inside it. After breakfast, she went to the porch step and sat down. The wind had been blowing since she arrived at this ranch, constant and underneath everything, pressing the gold grass flat in long, slow waves. She had gotten used to the sound of it the way a person gets used to a river, as something that would always be there. But this morning, the wind stopped. The grass stood straight. The dust settled. The quiet was so complete she could hear Kettle breathing on the other side of the porch. She sat with her forearms on her knees and her hands loose between them, and she looked at the fence post where the bread sat pale against the weathered wood. She had not planned to say anything. She had planned nothing about this morning, except the oats and the calf check and the pot of beans she would start for supper. But the wind had stopped, and in the stillness her mouth opened, and the words came out flat and measured and without any of the weight she had carried them with for 4 years. I was the second healer in my clan. The first one died. She paused, not for effect, because the next part required a different kind of breath. They said I wanted her position. I didn't. They said it didn't matter what I wanted. She did not elaborate. She did not look toward the door. She heard nothing from inside the house, for long enough that she thought he might not have heard, or might have heard and chosen to let it pass, which would have been fine. She had not said it for him. She had said it because the wind stopped and her mouth opened, and 4 years is a long time to hold 4 sentences behind your teeth. The screen door opened, his boots on the porch boards. He sat down on the step beside her, not close enough to touch, not far enough to be a statement. He set his coffee cup on the step between them and put his hands on his knees, the way a man does when he intends to stay for a while. A full minute passed. She counted it by Kettle's breathing. Honora got sick in November. His voice was the same as always, unhurried, carrying each word the distance it needed and no farther. I rode 3 hours for the doctor. He came. She died while he was washing his hands. He looked at the fence post. I baked her bread the next Sunday because I didn't know how to stop. 4 sentences. Same weight, same flatness. He did not reach for her hand. He did not offer comfort or comparison or any of the small consoling phrases people offer when they want the other person's grief to be smaller than it is. He laid his 4 sentences down beside hers, the way you lay stones on a table, each one finding its own place. And then he was quiet. Riva sat with it. The two confessions rested between them in the still air, equal and unadorned, requiring nothing. She had told people before, once or twice, in other places she had passed through. They had responded with questions, or sympathy, or the particular kind of careful distance that meant they were recalculating what she might be capable of. Nobody had responded with their own dead. She stood up. "I'll make coffee." "Already got some. That's cold by now." He looked at the cup on the step. "Fair enough." She went inside. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the morning light came through the window above the sink in a long yellow slant. She boiled water and measured grounds and poured 2 cups, and carried his out to the porch. He took it without looking up. She stood in the kitchen doorway and drank hers. Through the window she could see him on the step, watching the fence post where the bread sat in the late morning light. The grass was moving again, the wind returning in slow currents that bent the tops of the stalks and released them. He lifted the cup and drank and said, almost to himself, quiet enough that she had to hold her breath to catch it, "The land remembers who worked it." She heard it through the window. She did not answer. She was not sure the words were meant for her, or for the bread on the post, or for the woman whose name he had spoken for the first time in her hearing. She finished her coffee and washed both cups when he brought his in, and they moved through the rest of the day without speaking again. She cooked supper, beans with the dried herbs he had bought in town, and a skillet of cornbread that she cut while it was still too hot, because the knife work gave her hands something to do besides remember the weight of what she had said that morning. He ate. She ate standing by the window. Poke had come and gone midday, checking the east fence, and had left his plate scraped clean on the counter, which was as close to a compliment as the man seemed to get. After dark, she sat in the small room he had given her and looked at the canvas roll against the wall, the bone setters wrapped beneath the knives. She thought about the way he had sat on the step, the careful distance, the minute of silence before he spoke, how he had given back his own grief so hers would not sit alone on the porch like a single stone with no partner. She blew out the lamp. Through the window, she could see the fence post in the last of the moonlight, the bread still there, pale against dark wood. The bread on the fence post was gone by morning. For the first time, she wondered who took it. Not because it mattered, but because wondering about his life was new, and she had not decided whether to let it continue. Liddy Cross arrived the way she always did, without warning and without apology. The pony tied to the rail before Riva heard hooves on the packed dirt. The girl came through the kitchen door already talking, already reaching for whatever was closest to the edge of the counter, and Riva handed her a biscuit from the morning batch because it was easier than explaining that lunch was an hour away. "These are better than last week's," Liddy said. She sat on the stool by the window and kicked her boots against the rung. "Did you put something different in them?" "Lard instead of butter. Mama uses butter. Your mama's biscuits are fine. They're flat." Liddy bit into the biscuit and chewed with the open-mouthed concentration of a child who has not yet learned to perform table manners. Crumbs landed on her shirt. She did not brush them off. "Caleb said I could ride over whenever I wanted, as long as I told someone first. I told the dog." "Which dog?" "Ours. He doesn't listen either, but I told him." Riva wiped the counter and said nothing. Caleb was in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with a cup of water in his hand, watching Liddy eat the way he watched most things, quietly and from a distance that suggested he was not sure he had been invited to participate. He had come in from the barn when he heard the pony. His shirt was dark with sweat across the shoulders, and there was hay dust on his forearms, and he stood there drinking his water, as if this were any morning, as if a child eating biscuits in his kitchen were a thing that had always happened. Liddy looked at Riva, then at Caleb, then back at Riva. "Are you going to stay forever?" The question landed in the kitchen the way a rock lands in still water, without ceremony, and the silence that followed it spread outward in rings. Riva's hand stopped on the counter. She did not look up. "Because Caleb smiles now, and he didn't used to," Liddy said. She reached for a second biscuit. Mama said so. She said he looks like a person again. Caleb set his cup down on the edge of the counter. The sound was small and precise, and when Reva glanced toward the doorway, his face had gone very still, the way a man's face goes when someone has said something true, and he was not ready for the hearing of it. "Liddy," he said. "What?" "Fair enough." He picked up his cup, drank the rest, set it in the basin, and walked out. The screen door closed behind him, and his boots went down the porch steps and across the yard toward the barn, steady and unhurried, as if nothing had been said. Liddy ate her second biscuit. "Did I say something wrong?" "No." He looked funny. He looked like himself. Reva folded the cloth and set it by the basin. "You want to see the calf? It's walking better." They went to the barn. The calf was testing its splinted leg in the pen, taking small steps, and Liddy climbed the rail and talked to it the way she talked to everything, directly and without caution. Reva stood outside the pen and let the girl's voice fill the space so she would not have to hear her own thoughts yet. Caleb smiles now, and he didn't used to. She had not known that. She had seen the man every day for 4 weeks, and she had not looked at him the way a neighbor would, from enough distance to see the shape of a change. She had been too close. She had been inside it. Liddy rode home before lunch. Reva made the beans and cut the cornbread and set the table for 2, and they ate without speaking about what the girl had said. Caleb cleared his plate and went back out. She washed the dishes and swept the floor and checked the calf's splint and stood in the kitchen doorway watching the light change across the yard as the afternoon went golden long. That night she packed the canvas roll. Not all the way. She pulled it from against the wall and opened it flat on the bed and looked at the knives in their pockets and the bone setter's wrap beneath. And she began to roll it back up with her things inside, the way she had rolled it in 11 other places before this one. Her hands knew the motion. They had done it in darkness, in rain, in the back of a wagon moving before sunrise. She got halfway through and stopped. She sat on the edge of the bed. Green skin weathered by road dust looked grey in lamplight, and she studied her own forearms as if they belonged to someone else, someone she was trying to remember or trying to forget. She had never stayed anywhere long enough for the staying to cost her something, and she had come to believe this was not a choice but a law. The way gravity is a law. The way winter follows autumn. You move or you are found. You leave or the leaving is done to you, and it is worse. Liddy had named the cost. Caleb smiles now. If Reva left, he would stop. She would carry that with her the way she carried the wrap and the knives. One more thing she could not put down. One more weight that made the next place harder to reach and the staying shorter when she got there. She looked at the half-packed roll. The knives gleamed dull in the lamplight. Outside, the wind pressed against the house in long, steady gusts, and somewhere past the barn, she could hear kettles shifting on the porch. She set the roll down on the chair by the door. Did not unpack it. Did not finish packing it. She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the way houses do when they have been standing long enough to have opinions about who belongs inside them. In the early morning light she crossed the yard. The lintel above the barn door caught the sun. The old carving sharp with shadow. The land remembers who worked it. She stopped. Read it the way she had read it the first day. But the words sat differently now. Her hands had been in this soil. Her food was in that kitchen. The calf in the barn was walking because of her. She went inside. The kitchen smelled like bread. It was Sunday, and he had baked 2 loaves, and one was already gone from the counter, carried to the fence post in the grey light before she woke. He was standing at the stove with 2 plates in his hands. He looked at her. He looked at the canvas roll on the chair she had carried from her room. He set the plates on the table, one in front of his seat, one in front of hers. He did not ask. He did not make the leaving easier or harder. He set the table as if she were here and let her decide whether she was. She sat down. The roll stayed on the chair between them, like a third guest neither of them would introduce. Breakfast tasted the same as every other morning, which was the problem. She had made something consistent enough to miss. 3 weeks changed the kitchen. Not the shape of it, not the iron or the wood, or the placement of the table, but the smell. Riva had started folding orc spices into the food. Small amounts at first, a pinch of ground root in the stew, a thread of dried seed pod crushed into the cornbread batter, and the kitchen had taken on a warmth that was not just heat from the stove, but something older and less familiar, something that belonged to a different country, and had followed her here in the pouches she kept rolled inside her pack. Poke noticed first. He sat at the table with his plate and ate 3 bites and stopped. "This doesn't taste like anything I've had." "Good," Riva said. She was at the counter cutting onions, her back to him, her knife moving in short, precise strokes. Poke looked at his plate, looked at Caleb. Caleb was eating. "I mean, it's not bad," Poke said. "It's just not anything I can put a name on." "You don't need to name it. You need to eat it." Poke ate it. He scraped the plate and set it in the basin, and went back out to the fence line without another word, which was Poke's highest compliment. Caleb finished his own plate and stood and carried it to the basin himself, which he had started doing 3 weeks ago without remark. And Riva noticed this the way she noticed everything he did, by filing it and not responding. Liddy came on a Tuesday with a jar of preserves in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. She set the jar on the counter and handed the paper to Riva like it was nothing, like people handed Riva things every day. "From Mama," Liddy said. She said to say thank you. Riva unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat and small, and it said, "Thank you for the bread recipe. The girls loved it. You are welcome for supper any time. Clara Cross." Riva read it twice. She folded it along its creases and set it on the shelf above the stove where the salt lived, and she did not explain why she put it there instead of in her room or in the stove itself, and Liddy did not ask. "Can I have a biscuit?" "In the box." "The ones with the seeds." "Those aren't seeds. They're cracked peppercorn." Liddy took 2 and sat on her stool. "They're good. Mama won't let me have pepper. She says it's expensive." "It is." "Then how come you use it?" "Because the food is better with it." Liddy considered this with the seriousness of a child who has just been handed an adult logic she cannot yet dismantle, but intends to store for later. She ate both biscuits and wiped her hands on her trousers and went out to find the calf, which was walking well now, the splint off for a week, the leg holding true. Riva stood at the counter with her hand on the folded note. She had never been thanked in writing. She had been thanked in passing, in nods, in coins left on a table, in the absence of complaint. But no one had taken paper and ink and written her name next to the word "welcome." She moved her hand and went outside. The kitchen garden was her doing. She had started it 10 days ago without asking, turning soil along the south side of the house where the morning light hit longest. Caleb had come out of the barn and seen her kneeling in the dirt with a spade she had found in the outbuilding, and he had watched for a long moment and said nothing and gone back inside. The next morning there were stakes and twine set along the edges of her rows, driven in sometime before dawn. She did not mention the stakes. He did not mention the garden. The understanding between them operated below the level of speech, in the language of work done and work acknowledged by more work. She was turning soil when Caleb leaned against the barn door. Kettle lay at his feet, chin on her paws, watching the woman in the garden the way the dog watched everything, with a patience that suggested she had seen this before and was waiting to see how it ended. Caleb looked at the rows, at her hands in the dirt, at the shape she was making in ground that had not been worked since Honora planted marigolds the first spring, and then forgot them when the cattle took all her time. "The land remembers who worked it," he said, quiet, to the dog or to himself, or to the air between the barn and the garden, where the words could land without requiring an answer. Kettle's tail moved once against the ground. That evening the kitchen was warm and the windows were open, and the wind had stopped the way it sometimes stopped in late summer, all at once, as if the prairie had drawn a breath and was holding it. Reva was at the stove. The coffee pot was on the back burner, close to done, and she was wiping down the iron surface with the cloth she kept folded by the basin. Caleb came in from the porch. He crossed the kitchen behind her and reached past her shoulder for the coffee pot handle. His arm came close to her neck, closer than either of them had intended. She could feel the heat of his skin through the sleeve, or maybe she imagined it, or maybe the difference between feeling and imagining had stopped mattering sometime in the last 3 weeks, without her permission. He stopped. She turned. It was not a decision. It was not a thing either of them chose the way you choose to open a door or step off a porch. It was 3 seconds, and it was his mouth against hers, and her hand on the edge of the stove behind her, gripping the iron, and his hand still on the coffee pot handle, as if he had forgotten what he came for. And then it was over. He stepped back. 1 full step, his hand dropped from the pot. "That happened," she said. Her voice was level and flat, and if there was a tremor under it, she had buried it deep enough that it would not reach the surface for hours. "Yes." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved, and then he did, turning for the door, crossing the kitchen in 4 strides, the screen door closing behind him, his boots on the porch steps and across the yard toward the barn, in a line so straight it looked like he had drawn it with a rule. She stood at the stove. The coffee pot was still warm. She poured a cup and held it in both hands and drank it, standing up, because sitting down felt like a concession to something she was not ready to concede. She set the cup in the basin. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. Not much. Not the way hands tremble when you are cold, or sick, or frightened. The way they tremble when something has shifted inside your body and the surface has not caught up yet. When the stillness you have carried for years, like a second skin, has cracked, and what is underneath is not still at all. She closed them into fists, opened them, closed them again. They did not stop. Through the window, she could see his boot prints tracking from the kitchen door to the barn in a straight line, pressed clean into the dust, as if he had walked without looking back. He didn't. The deputy came on a Thursday. He was not looking for her. He was riding circuit, the kind of slow territorial sweep that men on government horses make when the weather is good and the paperwork is done. And he stopped at the well because the well was there and his canteen was low and the road forked just past the ranch where the Smithy settlement began downhill. Reva was in the yard. She had come out to dump the wash water, and she was standing with the basin against her hip when the horse turned up the track, and she knew before she saw the badge what kind of man was on it. The posture, the unhurried gait of a horse that was not going anywhere urgent, the way his eyes moved across the property, the way her eyes moved across rooms, cataloguing, filing, noting what was present and what was absent and what did not belong. He saw her. 4 seconds. His gaze found her face, her hands, the basin, the green of her skin against the gold grass behind her. And then it moved on. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so small it could have been the wind. He filled his canteen. He rode on. Reva stood in the yard with the basin pressed to her side until the sound of the horse faded past the fork. Then she went inside and set the basin in its place and wiped her hands on her apron and began peeling potatoes for the evening meal. She did not pack. She did not reach for the canvas roll in her room. She did something worse. She went still. Not the stillness of her hands, which had always been a kind of language, a fluency in waiting. This was different. This was the stillness of a woman who had pulled every living part of herself behind a wall and closed the gate. She cooked. She cleaned. She set the table. She answered when spoken to, and her answers were correct, and her food was good, and every trace of the woman who had put her knives in orc spice, and her hands in garden soil, and her mouth against a man's mouth at a stove 3 days ago, was gone. Caleb came in for supper and sat down and ate. He looked at her twice during the meal. She did not look back. He said the stew was good. She said there was more on the stove. "Reva, the bread's in the box if you want it." He did not push. He set his plate in the basin and went to the porch and sat on the step and watched the light go out of the sky, the way he had watched it every night for 2 years, except that for a few weeks the watching had been different, had been something other than waiting. And now it was not. She washed the dishes, she wiped the counter, she swept the floor, though the floor did not need sweeping. When she ran out of tasks, she stood at the window with her arms at her sides, hands that were large and very still, and watched the dark settle over the grass. He did not come to her door. He did not knock. He did not say the thing that men said when they felt something slipping. The urgent, fumbling reassurances that were meant to hold a thing in place, but only ever proved it was already moving. Instead, in the morning, he said something else. The south fence wants new wire before winter. She was at the stove. She did not turn. When the ground freezes, it'll heave the posts. Easier to set them in October. She cracked an egg. The yolk held. The garden will need a south wall by then too. Wind comes hard off the ridge once the season turns. She turned. He was at the table with his coffee, looking not at her, but at the window where the kitchen garden was visible in the early light. The rows she had planted, the stakes he had driven, the small green shoots that were beginning to show. He was not saying if, he was saying when the fence needs mending, when the garden needs a wall, when winter comes and the ground freezes and the wind shifts. He was building a calendar and she was inside it. Not as a question, but as a fact. The way the fence posts were facts, and the cattle were facts, and the bread was a fact. Sunday he baked 2 loaves. Both stayed on the table. He set them side by side on the cutting board and did not carry either one to the fence post. And he did not remark on this, did not look at the door or the window or the place where the path led out to the post. And the absence of the ritual was louder than anything he could have said. She noticed. She cut 2 slices and put 1 on each plate, and they ate breakfast in a silence that was not comfortable, but was not hostile either. A silence that was doing the work of holding 2 people in the same room, while one of them decided whether to stay. "Reckon the calf's ready for open pasture," he said. She looked at her plate. Legs solid, been walking true for 2 weeks. "I'll move her out this afternoon." He paused. "Polk can help with the south fence next week. When you want those garden rows extended, let me know where." When? He kept saying it, a quiet word, a small word, the most stubborn word in the language. Liddy came after lunch. She rode up on her pony and tied it to the rail and came into the kitchen without knocking because Liddy had never knocked and did not intend to start. She looked at Reva, who was standing at the counter with a dishcloth in her hand and nothing on her face. "You're still here," Liddy said. Reva looked at the girl, 8 years old, dusty boots, hair tied back with a piece of twine that was coming loose. "Yes." "Good." Liddy climbed onto her stool. "Can I have lunch?" Reva set down the cloth. She pulled a plate from the shelf and put food on it. The remains of the midday meal, stew and cornbread, and 2 of the peppercorn biscuits Liddy favored, and she set it in front of the girl. Caleb came in from the porch. He did not speak. He sat at the table, and Liddy told him about the foal her father was breaking, and how it had bitten Polk's hat off his head last Tuesday. And Caleb listened, and Reva moved through the kitchen, doing the work of feeding people. Because the work was still here, and she was still here, and those 2 things were, for now, the same. 3 plates at the table. 1 small, 1 large, one that had been here longer than any of them. The deputy was 6 miles south by now, and had already forgotten the green-skinned woman at the well. She had not forgotten him, but she was making lunch. She woke before the light. The room was dark, and the wind was still, and the canvas roll sat against the wall where she had set it the first night, within reach, the way a woman keeps the things she might need if she has to leave before dawn. Reva sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. 5 weeks. She had been here 5 weeks, and the roll had not moved from that spot except once. The night she had packed it halfway and set it on the chair and let it sit between them, at breakfast, like an accusation, neither of them answered. It was still tied. The knives on top, the bone setters wrapped beneath. Everything in the order she had carried it through 4 territories and 11 kitchens, and not one place that had asked her to unpack. She untied the cord. The canvas unrolled across the bed. 6 knives, each in its pocket, each one sharpened to a different weight, because different work required different edges. Beneath them the wrap, linen and splintwood, and the small jar of salve she had carried since the clan, since before the clan, since the first healer taught her which bones would mend and which ones would not, and how to tell the difference with nothing but her fingers, and the sound a joint made when it was set true. She carried the knives to the kitchen. The drawer stuck. It always stuck. Caleb's knives were inside, 3 of them, a skinning blade and a bread knife and a utility knife, with a handle worn smooth from years of the same hand, gripping the same way. She had seen them every day. She had never put hers beside them. She put hers beside them, not on top, not angled for a quick grab, the way she had laid them on every counter in every kitchen she had worked. She set them in the drawer, handles aligned with his, edges facing the same direction, and she closed the drawer and it stuck, and she opened it again and closed it slower, and this time it held. The wrap she hung on the hook by the door. The hook had held a coat once. The coat was gone. The wrap hung there, visible, the linen ties dangling where anyone who entered would see them. And she stepped back and looked at it the way she had looked at rooms her whole life, assessing what was present and what was absent and what had changed. Everything had changed. Nothing looked different. She heard his boots on the porch. The door opened. Caleb came in with his hat in one hand and stopped. He was looking at the wrap. His eyes moved from the hook to the linen to the small jar of salve visible in the pocket, and then to her. "That's been in your pack this whole time," he said. "Yes, the whole time. Since before I came here, since before a lot of things." He looked at the wrap again. He did not touch it. He crossed to the kitchen and opened the drawer, and she watched his face when he saw the knives, hers and his, side by side, and the sound he did not make was louder than anything she had heard in 5 weeks on this ranch. He closed the drawer. He stood with his hand on the counter and his back to her, and she could see the breath move through him. One long pull that lifted his shoulders and let them down again. "Reva. The land remembers who worked it," she said. He turned. She held his gaze. She had practiced not holding gazes her entire adult life, had trained her eyes to assess and move on, to file information without lingering, because lingering was a kind of staying, and staying was a thing she did not do. She held his gaze now. She let it cost her what it cost. "Reckon it does," he said. His voice was rough. He cleared his throat. "Reckon it does at that." He set the table. 2 plates. Then he paused with his hand on the shelf and pulled down a third and set it at the end where the stool was. Liddy's spot, the place that had become Liddy's spot through nothing more than repetition, and the fact that nobody had told her she could not sit there. "She'll be here soon," Reva said. "She's always here on Sundays. I made extra biscuits." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not catalogue. Something that was not grief and was not relief, but lived in the territory between them, where the old things ended and the new things had not yet been named. "I'll get the coffee on," he said. She had already started it. He saw the pot on the stove and nodded once and sat down at the table in his chair, and she stood at the counter in the kitchen that smelled of dry grass and stove iron and the particular warmth of bread that had just come out of the oven. 2 loaves, golden topped, sitting on the cutting board side by side. The fence post stood bare in the early light outside the window. She could see it from where she stood. A plain post at the edge of the yard, the one he had walked to every Sunday with a loaf meant for a woman who would never eat it. And this morning it held nothing but itself. She did not remark on it. He did not look at it. Hoofbeats on the track, small ones. Liddy's pony came around the bend and Liddy was on it, boots too big for her stirrups, hair already escaping the twine, and she tied the pony to the rail and came through the door without knocking. "I'm hungry," Liddy said. "Sit down," Reva said. Liddy climbed onto her stool. She looked at the 3 plates and the 2 loaves, and the coffee and the biscuits, and Reva standing at the counter and Caleb sitting at the table, and Kettle lying in the kitchen doorway, not the other doorway, not the one he had guarded for 2 years, but this one. The one where the warmth was, and the food was, and the people were. "Are those the peppercorn ones?" Liddy asked. "Yes." "Good." Caleb cut the bread. Reva poured the coffee. Liddy reached for a biscuit before anyone told her she could, and nobody told her she could not. The wind came through the window carrying the smell of gold grass, and late summer, and the garden that would need a south wall by October, and the kitchen held all three of them the way a good kitchen holds the people who come back to it, which is to say without effort, without ceremony, without asking whether they deserved to be there. Nobody said grace. They just ate.